Hello again, Year 11. We thought we'd upload a second masterclass on Macbeth for you, seeing as you've got a mock exam in a few weeks on this text. Remember that you should be making notes during this, and obviously you don't have to watch the whole thing in one go, but do make sure that you watch all of it, even if it's in stages. We'd hope by this point that you do know the plot of Macbeth, but if you are still unsure about anything, just go to the following page on YouTube and it will recap all of the plot for you. Okay, so the first thing that we need to understand is tragedy as a genre. So a conventional tragedy has 5 acts. That's according to Aristotle, the philosopher, his model of tragedy. In this typical structure, we see the tragic hero, or the protagonist, who obviously is Macbeth in this case, progress through different stages which ultimately result in his demise or his death. So every tragic hero has a tragic flaw, a fatal flaw, or a hamartia. Hamartia is the most sophisticated term to describe Macbeth's tragic flaw of ambition. So that tragic flaw, or that hamartia, causes the hero's dramatic fall from being highly respected and esteemed at the beginning of the play to becoming vilified at the end. So by the end, he's regarded as a villain. The audiences in Jacobean times would be aware of the outcome of this genre of play right at the beginning, so they would know if they were going to see a tragedy that the protagonist would end up dead at the end of it. So Shakespeare, even in Act 1, often foreshadows the fate of the hero. So in Act 1 of Macbeth, Duncan is heard to say about the original Thane of Cawdor that he is a most disloyal traitor. So that foreshadows to the audience that perhaps Macbeth himself will become a disloyal traitor. Duncan also says in Act 1 that the Thane of Cawdor was a gentleman on whom he built an absolute trust. Again, this would foreshadow to more insightful members of the audience that perhaps Macbeth too is a man who Duncan absolutely trusts, and therefore Macbeth may betray him in the future. So also the tragic hero goes through stages of hamartia, tragic flaw, hubris, which is excessive pride, which we see in Macbeth when he becomes king and he starts throwing commands around. They go through a stage of peripeteia, which is a reversal of fortune. So this would probably occur around Act 4 in Macbeth, where people start to turn on him, his troops start to desert him. Obviously it begins earlier in the play when Banquo and Macduff begin to suspect him of the murder of King Duncan. They then go through the stage of anagnorisis, which is where the protagonist makes an important discovery or something is revealed. So in this case, it could be where the witches in Act 4 reveal to Macbeth that he needs to beware Macduff. They then go through a stage of nemesis, which is where they meet their inescapable fate. So that would be the meeting with Macduff, whom Macbeth has been warned about. Obviously, at that meeting, Macduff reveals that he wasn't born in the natural way from his mother. So it would seem that Macduff can, and indeed does, kill Macbeth. Before that point, though, we see that Macbeth goes through a stage of catharsis, which is the hero's downfall, where nobody respects him any longer, and where the audience are encouraged to feel pity for the protagonist. So even though we don't particularly like Macbeth by the end of the play, we are supposed to feel some pity for this once great man who, simply because of his one tragic flaw of ambition, completely ruins himself and completely degrades himself by the end of the play. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at are some of the motifs used throughout the play Macbeth. Now, if you're unsure what a motif is, it's basically when an image recurs throughout the whole structure of the play. So I've listed some of these motifs for you, and I'll just explain how they're used in the play. So the first one is the recurring image of darkness and light. So if you look at the first quotation there, Macbeth says this in Act 1, after he's met the witches. So he says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." So within this quotation, you can see that he is juxtaposing light, represented through the stars and the fires, against his ambition, which is represented through the black. So you can see then that at this point he's very aware that his ambition is associated with evil, and he doesn't want his evil to be exposed by the powers of good, by the light. The next quotation then is stated by Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5 in her soliloquy. So when she calls upon the spirits to assist her in her plan, she asks, "Pall me in the dunnest smoke of hell," meaning that she wants to be cloaked in very dark smoke from hell. So again, she's assimilating herself with evil through that metaphor of darkness. So she doesn't want to be exposed through goodness and through light. And then finally, in Act 5, we are told, after Lady Macbeth has gone mad with guilt, that she has light by her continually. So it would seem by this point Lady Macbeth wants to get back in touch with the good side of herself. So it's almost like she's looking to find God again. She's looking to seek forgiveness, because that's represented by the light. Okay, moving on to sleep then as a motif. After Macbeth has murdered King Duncan, he states in Act 2, Scene 2, "Macbeth shall sleep no more." So we can see then that one of the punishments that Jacobeans believed would be enforced if you committed regicide would be insomnia. So at this point, Macbeth realises that that is going to be one of his punishments, that his mind is going to be so plagued by guilt that he'll no longer be able to sleep. He then goes on to acknowledge that sleep is the balm of hurt minds, meaning that when we're suffering mental distress, that when we go to sleep, it actually soothes us. So it's like a balm, it's like an ointment that helps us recover. However, because he's now suffering with sleeplessness, with insomnia, he's going to be unable to repair emotionally from what's happened. Then we hear Lady Macbeth say to her husband in Act 3, after he's seen Banquo's ghost, "You lack the season of all natures, sleep." So she believes that the reason he's hallucinating and the reason he's seen the ghost is because he's not getting enough sleep. So again, we see that the Jacobeans regarded sleep as some kind of soothing process. And then finally, talking about Lady Macbeth in Act 5, I think it's the doctor that says that she is in this slumbery agitation. So basically what that means is Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking, but she's never actually lying down. She's constantly in a state of distress due to her guilt. Okay, moving on to the theme of duplicity, or the motif of duplicity. So duplicity basically means that you can be two-faced. So the way you seem, your appearance, is actually different to the reality of the way you are. So we see that motif throughout the play. In Act 1, for example, when Lady Macbeth is trying to persuade her husband to go through with the regicide, she says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." So she's suggesting there that he needs to assume this appearance of being loyal, whereas actually underneath that he's plotting an evil plan. So the serpent obviously is linked to the devil, that image of the snake in the Garden of Eden. So she's suggesting that he needs to be forming an evil plan. The next quotation that's linked to duplicity, Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 7, when she's persuading Macbeth, says, "What cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan?" Now, just looking at that verb choice of perform, it reinforces that Lady Macbeth is quite comfortable with dissembling. Now, what that means is that she's quite comfortable with acting in a role that is quite different to her true personality. She also says in this scene that she will make her griefs and clamour roar upon his death, meaning that after he's discovered, she's quite prepared to turn on the tears, fake tears, to give the impression that she's very distressed by the murder. So you can see that she's incredibly duplicitous. The next quotation we've got then is at the end of Act 1, Scene 7, where Macbeth has agreed to go through with the murder, but he acknowledges that false face doth hide what the false heart doth know. So he's suggesting there that he's going to have to put on this mask of friendliness to the king, when deep down inside his heart is planning something quite the opposite. So there's this imagery of masks and wearing a mask, which is a metaphor for being false and fake. And then linked to that, later in Act 3, Macbeth says that they have to make our faces vizards to our hearts. So a vizard is another word for a mask. So yet again, it's reinforcing the idea that they have to appear to be one thing when actually they are behaving quite differently behind closed doors. The next motif is poison, illness and contamination. So in Act 1, Scene 5, in Lady Macbeth's first soliloquy, she believes that Macbeth is ambitious and wants to become king, but she thinks that he is without the illness should attend it. So she's suggesting that he's too good, he's too pure, and we know that at the beginning of the play he is very heroic. So she's almost implying that he needs to be infected or diseased with evil, which is why she then calls upon the spirits. So she says, "Fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty." So she's acting as if she is an empty vessel, and she's asking evil spirits to possess her body. She will then transfer that evil to Macbeth, and she actually says that she will pour my spirits in thine ear. So she's going to transfer it to him. Macbeth then acknowledges in his soliloquy before killing the king that if he goes through with the regicide, he knows that it will return to plague the inventor, meaning that he's aware that afterwards he will be constantly diseased, constantly traumatized by the murder that he's carried out, and he'll never recover from that. The next quotation's from Act 3, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind." So that very clearly links to this idea of poison. So after the regicide, we can see that his mind is full of venom. He knows that there's no returning. His mind will never be pure again. So scorpions obviously have venom in their tails, in their sting. So he knows that his mind has been corrupted permanently by this regicide. Then later in Act 5, when Macbeth receives news of Lady Macbeth's madness, he says to the doctor, "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased?" So her mental illness is referred to using the metaphor of disease. So again, her mind has been spoiled, it's been corrupted by evil. And then right towards the end, Macbeth admits, "I have supped full with horrors." So again, he's been filled. Supped means he's almost drunk enough evil to last him a lifetime. So he's been filled with that contamination. His soul has been contaminated irreversibly. Okay, the last motif on this slide then is nature. So when the prophecy is made to Banquo that his sons will become kings, Macbeth shows his envy, his jealousy of that, and he moans about the fact that the seed of Banquo will be kings. Now, seed, that image there, that natural image, is used to suggest that Banquo can rear healthy children with his wife. Now, that's quite interesting because even though it's suggested Lady Macbeth has been pregnant, because she says, I have given suck, meaning she's breastfed a child, we know that they have no surviving children. So the fact that Banquo has been able to rear children who may become kings makes Macbeth incredibly jealous and envious because he cannot produce healthy offspring. That links then to the two quotations beneath that where he complains about having a fruitless crown. So he's become king, he's got the crown, but he's fruitless, meaning he is infertile effectively because he can't bear fruit, which is a metaphor for him not being able to have healthy children. And in a similar sense, he talks about the barren scepter that he holds. So the scepter is an ornament that the king would hold when he's sitting on the throne. So he's got that, he's acquired that, but he's still barren. Now, barren is a word linked to nature, and again, it means that land is infertile, that nothing grows there. So we can see that Macbeth is really insecure about the fact that he will never have a male heir to inherit the throne, which in some ways makes the regicide completely pointless. So Macbeth will have his short-lived experience as king, but then he'll have no son to pass that role down to. Okay, so continuing on, the next motif in the play is heaven and hell. So in Act 1, Scene 5, Lady Macbeth calls upon the spirits by saying, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts." So spirits would strictly be associated with evil, with hell. So you can see there that she's assimilating herself with evil rather than good. Later in Act 1, Scene 7, when Macbeth is debating whether or not he should go through with a regicide in his soliloquy, he talks about how if he were to murder King Duncan, how the angels, trumpet-tongued, would reveal his crime to everybody. So he's quite aware that God and the heavens and the angels are on Duncan's side and that they would expose his crime, which ultimately happens at the end of the play. And then he also talks about in that soliloquy how if he were to take off Duncan, meaning if he were to murder him, then it would result in deep damnation. Now, damnation basically means that you are sent to hell. So Macbeth is fully aware of the consequences of this regicide, and the fact that he still goes through with it just reinforces how ambitious he is and how much he's persuaded by his wife, because he's prepared to risk hell for that very short-lived experience of being king. Okay, the next motif is the supernatural. So obviously we've got the three witches in the play. In Act 1, Scene 3, when Macbeth and Banquo first meet the witches on the heath and they make their prophecies, Macbeth is so ambitious, so keen to hear more, that he commands them to stay. So he says, "Stay, you imperfect speakers." Now the witches vanish at that point. So the first quotation there is a stage direction. Now this is significant because even though Macbeth is a Thane, and even though he commands them to stay, using that imperative, the witches disobey him. So this would suggest that the powers of the supernatural are actually superior to those of human beings, which explains why Macbeth is manipulated by the witches, because they seem to have greater powers than he does. We are then told that the witches are not like the inhabitants of the earth. So this just reinforces that Macbeth and Banquo do recognise that these characters are not human. So that proves that back in the Jacobean times, people would willingly believe in witches and ghosts and the supernatural. So that's a little bit different to nowadays, when we'd be a little bit more sceptical. Macbeth, I've referred to this earlier, he calls them imperfect speakers. However, that changes at the end of the play to the point where he calls them juggling fiends. So his attitude towards them changes. At the beginning, when they are telling him things that he wants to hear about becoming king, he doesn't describe them in such an offensive way. At the end, when he realises that he's lost his wife, all the respect of everybody in Scotland, he's lost his best friend, he understands that he's been manipulated by supernatural forces. So the witches now have become fiends, which are basically demons or devils. So he realises that they were a hellish force. The word juggling suggests that the witches have used him for their own entertainment. So they've played with him almost, in the sense that you would juggle things and you'd throw them around. So they've manipulated him, they've used him. The next motif is blood. So Macbeth acknowledges in Act 3 that he is in blood stepped so far. So he realises that he's killed several people by this point, Duncan, Banquo, and it's almost like a domino effect. Once you've killed a couple of people, you have to keep killing people because they will start to suspect you. So anyone that gets in his way, he knows that he's going to have to eliminate them. He's going to have to get rid of them. So he started a chain reaction. This explains why later in the play he orders the murder of Macduff's wife and family, because Macduff also suspects him. So he realises now that now he's got blood on his hands from Duncan and Banquo, that he's simply got to get more blood on his hands. Okay, the next quotation then, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" is in Act 2, Scene 2, after the murder, when he's feeling incredibly guilty. So obviously this is an example of hyperbole, of exaggeration, because obviously all of the ocean would wash away the blood on his hands. However, it's just emphasising how guilty he feels about the murder. So symbolically, even when the blood has been washed away, the guilt will still be there. He later says blood will have blood, which links to what I've said a minute ago about the fact that if you spill somebody's blood, more blood will be spilt as a result. So it could be through people getting revenge on you and killing you, or it could be through you having to murder more people who are suspicious of you. So he started this chain reaction. Later in the play, in Act 5, Lady Macbeth goes mad, and as you probably know, she keeps carrying out the action of washing her hands. So even though the blood of King Duncan is long gone, she can still see it there. So she says, "Out, out, damned spot," and she's, trying to scrape the imaginary blood off her hands. So again, that imaginary blood is symbolic of her guilt. She then says, in a quotation that's quite similar to Macbeth's quotation about Neptune's ocean, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." So whereas she was quite unconcerned about that blood in Act 2, she said, "A little water clears us of this deed." So she's quite flippant. She just tells her husband to go and wash his hands, and then it will be gone and done with. Here, she's completely changed her tune, and she's saying that even if she were to have all the perfumes, it would not get rid of that smell, that stench of blood, which again is a symbol of her guilt. And then finally, the motif of madness occurs throughout the structure of the play. So in Act 2, when Macbeth is acting incredibly paranoid after the murder, Lady Macbeth loses her patience with him, and she tells him these deeds must not be thought on, so it will make us mad. Now this is a really good example of foreshadowing. It's quite ironic that Lady Macbeth tells her husband not to obsess about the murder, not to think about it again, just to get over it. Later on in the play, however, she is the one that becomes obsessed with it, and she is the one who starts to feel massive guilt and thinks about it all the time. So as a result, she is the one that goes insane. So that's quite a good example of irony and of foreshadowing. Another quotation from Act 1, Scene 3, where Banquo and Macbeth meet the witches. Banquo's reaction to the witches is a little bit more suspicious. So he asks, "Have we eaten on the insane route that takes reason prisoner?" So rather than believing the witches straight away, Banquo questions whether they've actually eaten something, a plant called hemlock, on their travels home across the heath, which actually has hallucinogenic effects. So it would be a plant that actually makes you hallucinate and see things. So again, he is a little bit more cynical and skeptical about whether the witches are real. And then the final quotation that links to the motif of madness is when Lady Macbeth is described as having a mind diseased. So that was mentioned earlier. So again, just suggesting that her mind has been corrupted by evil and it now can't be plucked out of there. Right, so I'm now going to talk about some quick wins. These tend to be structural points or points about dramatic devices that Shakespeare uses. So they're often credited quite highly if you can fit these points into your essay. So one thing that you should always consider is the role reversal of Macbeth and his wife throughout the play. So at the beginning, their gender roles are quite unconventional. So Lady Macbeth is clearly the matriarch in the relationship. So within Dunsinane Castle, she clearly has control. Even though Macbeth outside of the castle is the public man, she is the one who ultimately makes the commands inside the castle. However, in Act 3, in a very pivotal moment, we see the relationship reverse back to conventions and Macbeth regains authority. So when Macbeth and his wife are discussing what's to be done with Banquo, as Banquo suspects Macbeth, and Banquo's sons are prophesied to be kings, Lady Macbeth asks her husband what's to be done, and Macbeth responds with, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." So here we can see that it is actually Macbeth who is going to devise the plan to get rid of Banquo. This is in direct contrast to earlier in the play when it was Lady Macbeth who actually devised the plan to kill Duncan. So we see the role reversal there. You should also consider how Shakespeare juxtaposes Macbeth against other characters, particularly Banquo and Macduff. If you're unsure what juxtaposes means, it means that he sets Macbeth up in contrast to those two other characters. So obviously we see Macbeth's disloyalty being juxtaposed against Macduff and Banquo's loyalty to their king. In Act 3, Shakespeare does reveal to us through Banquo's soliloquy that he too is quite ambitious and he's quite keen for his sons to become kings, as the witches prophesied. However, the point that Shakespeare seems to be making is that Banquo does not act upon those prophecies, whereas Macbeth does, because he's spurred on by overwhelming ambition. So we're seeing that even though it's human nature to feel ambitious and to aspire to be better than what we are, not everybody is prepared to go to the ends that Macbeth goes to achieve those ambitions. You can also comment on structural techniques like circular narrative. So at the beginning of the play, the disloyal traitor is executed. So we see that at the end as well with Macbeth. So he becomes the disloyal traitor and he too is executed by Macduff. So at the beginning, as I mentioned earlier, this could be foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is also used with Lady Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 2. So after the murder, Macbeth is incredibly paranoid and Lady Macbeth loses her patience with him and she tells Macbeth to calm down and she says to him, If we don't calm down, so it will make us mad. So that in itself is quite ironic, and it foreshadows her later madness in the play. So it's ironic because she tells Macbeth not to think about it too much, consider it not so deeply, but she herself doesn't follow that advice, and she later goes mad with guilt. We also see foreshadowing when Duncan says he was a man on whom I built an absolute trust about the original Thane of Cawdor. Because again, Macbeth becomes somebody who he also can't trust, as we know. And then finally, you should try to make sure that you comment on dramatic devices that Shakespeare uses. So Macbeth mainly uses asides out of all the characters. So asides are when a character is on the stage, other characters are present, but they say a line that isn't intended to be heard by the other characters. So gradually Macbeth begins to use more asides in Act 1. This suggests that he is becoming more duplicitous. So he's becoming more secretive. He's not being open with those around him. He's not even being open with Banquo, his best friend. Gradually, those asides of Macbeth's develop into soliloquy, which are longer dramatic monologues where the character is completely alone on the stage. So this development shows that Macbeth starts to become more secretive, but ultimately he becomes very introspective, very private. And that's because his true inner thoughts can't be shared with those around him, because obviously he's considering going through with regicide. Okay, so it's very important that you know a little bit about historical context for assessment objective 3. This will help you understand the play and Shakespeare's intentions more effectively. So Shakespeare actually wrote plays for Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. So when we look at Elizabeth I's reign in England, she ruled before 1603. She was renowned for her ruthless ways and the harsh laws and decisions that she made. However, it's rumoured that after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, who was James I's mother, Elizabeth had actually ordered that execution, but it's believed that after that she actually locked herself away in her room for a week and cried in private. So this is interesting because if we think about the play Macbeth, which was written for James I, Lady Macbeth has lots of similarities with Queen Elizabeth I. So similarly to Elizabeth, Lady Macbeth is seen as being very ruthless and quite harsh. However, we know that Lady Macbeth would have been unable to kill King Duncan because he reminds her of her father when he's asleep. So we can see that both of these very matriarchal women actually have a more sensitive, compassionate side that they do not like to show to members of the public for fear of them looking weak. So if we look a little bit at James I's reign, this was after 1603. So Shakespeare wrote the play in 1604, and when he was writing his plays for James I, his company of actors who acted out the plays were called the King's Men. So you can see there that they were basically sponsored, or James I was the patron of that acting company. So that makes it clear why Shakespeare wanted to flatter James I's views and opinions in the play. So James I believed witches were real, and he actually supervised quite a lot of witch trials. So this explains why in the play Shakespeare has included the witches as characters, and Macbeth and Banquo believe in the witches. James I also wrote a book about the supernatural called Demonology, so we can see that it was a preoccupation of James. He was really quite fascinated by that theme. James also had a particular fear of being assassinated because when he was a baby, someone tried to kill him, And obviously later, with the gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament where James I was. So obviously this made James pretty paranoid about having his life taken. This explains why the play, the main part of the plot, is about the murder of a king. It also explains why, by the end of the play, Shakespeare ensures that the rightful heir to the throne, Malcolm, returns to the throne. Otherwise, James I, who was watching that play, would think that God did not punish people who committed regicide. So Shakespeare has to reassure James by the end of the play that anyone who interferes with the divine right of kings will be punished appropriately. To conclude, James I was patriarchal, so he believed that men were more capable of being in power and positions of authority. Because of what Elizabeth I, his predecessor, had done to his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, he believed that if a woman did have any kind of power, that she would abuse it and that she would make rash decisions. So therefore, in the play again, we see that women, like Lady Macbeth, and the witches to some degree, who do have power, often use that power inappropriately, and they use it to manipulate rather than for good purposes. So if we go on a little bit to talking about exam strategy, you'll get one question, and that question will be based on a pivotal extract, which will be the starting point for your essay. So just to clarify, a pivotal extract is a point in the play where something is revealed, where something dramatic happens, or where something changes. So I'm sure you can actually go through as part of your revision and plot some of these pivotal moments. So it could be when Macbeth sees the dagger, it could be when Lady Macbeth persuades him to commit the regicide, it could be at the end, the fight scene between Macduff and Macbeth. So those are just a few of several that you could choose. Once you have begun by looking at the extract, you'll need to refer to not only that extract, but also the whole play. If you don't refer to the whole play, so if you haven't revised properly, then you will be penalised for that, and you will get an absolute maximum of half marks for not talking about the theme across the whole play. You'll need to make sure that you cover all assessment objectives. So remember that there are 4 for Macbeth. So AO1 is the ability to write a relevant response to the question. It's also the ability to make judicious references or use quotations. AO2 is your ability to analyse writers' methods. And with plays, writers' methods include language, structure, form, and dramatic devices. It's a good idea sometimes to jot down the AOs at the top of your essay, and then when you're proofreading at the end, just consider whether you have covered those assessment objectives. Assessment objective 4 is worth 4 marks, and it's for SPAG, spelling, punctuation and grammar, so just take some care with that on this essay. You'll need to comment regularly on Shakespeare's intentions. That's particularly relevant for assessment objective 3. So you'll need to think about why he might have shaped the events and the characters the way he did. So to understand that, this is where you need to know a little bit about the historical context, the historical background. So we've just mentioned on the previous slide that Shakespeare crafted Lady Macbeth's character the way he did to support James I's views about women in power. So that's where your historical context should be linked to events in the play and to help you understand why Shakespeare did what he did. Finally, you should make sure that you are using tentative language in your essays. So tentative language is basically where you use words like might, possibly, and perhaps. None of us actually know why Shakespeare did what he did, so none of us know 100%. So you should use this to your advantage, and you should give alternative interpretations. So get used to using phrases like Shakespeare might have done this because, or this could possibly suggest, however, it might also suggest something else. Perhaps Shakespeare wanted the audience to think that, or alternatively, he might have wanted the audience to react in this way. So get used to using those words, might, could, possibly, perhaps, alternatively, and it shows that you're thinking of more than one interpretation. Okay, so we're now going to look at some key quotations for each of the characters. For the main characters, I've tried to limit this to 3 quotations so that it's not too much for you to learn. These might not necessarily be the most obvious quotations that you'd link to a character, but remember that earlier when I spoke about the motifs of the play, I did actually mention some quotations there that you may wish to refer back to. So these ones are different quotations. So I've tried to cover the beginning, middle and end of the play for most of the characters. So if we look at Macbeth to start with, one of the best quotations that you can know for him is in Act 1, Scene 7, where he says at the end of his soliloquy, where he's debating whether or not to kill the king, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition." So the end of this soliloquy indicates that Macbeth is fully aware that his tragic flaw, or his hamartia, is ambition, and he seems to be quite ashamed of that. Now remember that in the Jacobean times, ambition wasn't viewed in the positive way that it is nowadays. So back in those times, ambition was seen as sinful because it was an insult to God. So if you wanted to be more than what God had intended, you were actually going against the great chain of being, which said that each of us had a specific role in society. So when Macbeth aspires to be king, he's actually offending God, because it shows that he's not happy with his lot as Thane of Cawdor. Okay, if we're going to look at methods within this quotation, we can see that Macbeth's ambition is personified. So vaulting suggests that his ambition is so powerful that it jumps over any kind of doubts he has about killing the king. So it's almost as if his ambition has taken on a life of its own, and he's powerless to resist its impact. So as I've said earlier, he's leaping above his status, so he's going against that great chain of being and the divine right of kings. When he talks about "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent," a spur is something that you'd have on the stirrups when you're horse riding, and you actually kick the horse with them, so they're like a spike that would prick into the horse's sides to make it run faster. So when he uses this metaphor, he's suggesting that he's got no reason to spur on his ambition to kill the king, other than that very fact that he's ambitious. So it would be much easier if the king were a bad man. He would find it a lot easier to go through with the regicide, because he would have other valid reasons. However, here he's acknowledging that the king is in fact meek. He actually says earlier in the soliloquy that Duncan is great in office, so he's great at his job. So Macbeth is fully aware that the only thing spurring him on is that ambition, but he cannot stop it. It's too powerful. It's like a horse that's bolted out of the stable, and he can't stop it now. So moving on to later in the play in Act 4, this is after Macbeth has been to visit the witches for the second time. We're told that he commands one of his servants to give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes. So he's referring to the murder of Macduff's wife and children. Now, the reason that I've given you this quotation is because we can see Macbeth using imperatives in give. So he's abusing his power and authority as king, commanding people, bossing people around. But also it shows just how ruthless and inhumane he's become. So he's so paranoid and fearful of being overthrown as king that he's prepared to eliminate anyone who is a possible rival or anyone who is suspicious of him. Now, obviously, when he went back to the witches, they did say to him, "Beware Macduff." So Macbeth here is trying to warn Macduff away by killing his wife and his children. So even though Macbeth thinks that none born of woman shall harm him, he's still paranoid about Macduff, and he would rather have Macduff out of the way. So by killing his wife and his children, he hopes that that will deter Macduff from getting revenge for the murder of Duncan. And then we also see in Act 5, again, Macbeth's tyranny when he uses another imperative, hang those that talk of fear. So he's basically ordering the execution of any of his followers who are afraid in any way. He just won't tolerate anyone feeling fear. Now that's quite easy to say if you've just been told or you believe that you're near enough invincible because none born of woman can kill you. But when you're an ordinary human being, then it's quite natural to feel fear. So we can see that Macbeth has become very heartless, very insensitive, and he is the tyrant who Macduff names him as at the end of the play. This is a brilliant quotation to look at for Macbeth, and it's from Act 5, where Macbeth performs a soliloquy. So in it he says, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage." So we can see here when he talks about life being a poor player, a player would be another word for an actor in Jacobean times. So he's using the metaphor of acting here. So we've already mentioned earlier that duplicity is a theme. So acting one way in public, but actually being something else in private. So he's picking up on that imagery again of acting. So here he's suggesting that in life we all have our roles to play, but ultimately, like an actor on the stage, once we have fulfilled that role, we're forgotten. As soon as we leave the stage or as soon as we die, we're forgotten. So this is a moment of realization for Macbeth at the end of the play. And remember that he doesn't have any heirs, he doesn't have any children to leave the throne to. So it all seems quite pointless to him at this stage. So if you look in the bottom right hand corner of the slide, we can see then that Macbeth has reached his stage of catharsis. So he's reflecting on what he's actually achieved by becoming king. And what he actually realises is that life's only very brief and temporary. So he's starting to question whether pursuing the crown was actually worth it. And it would seem to be that the answer's no, it wasn't worth it at all when you consider everything he's lost. When he talks about the actor, the metaphorical actor that he's become because he's acting as king, he talks about strutting across the stage. So that choice of verb suggests that Macbeth has been quite arrogant and quite proud when he's performed the role of king. But yet again, he's had his moment of glory, and after he leaves the stage or after he's murdered, he'll be forgotten. Or, worse, he'll be remembered only as a tyrant, not as a good king like Duncan. And then if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, I've just summed up another method that you can talk about. So the motif of acting then reinforces that Macbeth was actually an imposter. So according to the divine right of kings and the great chain of being, he was never actually supposed to be in that role, and he's fully aware of that, and he knows that he's going to be punished for it. So he's performing a soliloquy here, and he's reflecting ultimately on how pointless it all was. Just for a little bit of historical context, acting was a poorly paid profession in the Jacobean times, so you could stretch this idea further and say that by using acting imagery, Macbeth's not really profited from becoming king which explains why he refers to life as being a poor player. So if we move on to Lady Macbeth and look at how she's presented in Act 1, as I said earlier, there are other quotations used for Lady Macbeth that you're perhaps more familiar with, but those ones are mentioned when I talk about motifs earlier on in this PowerPoint. So we're going to look at something she says in Act 1, Scene 7, when she's persuading and manipulating Macbeth into committing regicide. So she says to him, "Screw your courage to the sticking place and will not fail." So effectively, she's accusing him of being cowardly when she talks about screw your courage. Now this is a metaphor, and it refers to a stringed instrument that they would have back in those times. And the strings of this instrument have gone slack. They need tightening to make it play in tune again. So Lady Macbeth, by using this metaphor, is suggesting that Macbeth's purpose has gone slack. So he needs to tighten up his courage again. He needs to galvanise himself or brace himself again to carry out the plan. So refocus himself. Obviously we can see that she uses imperatives here in screw. So this indicates the role reversal in their relationship. So she is clearly the matriarch within Dunsinane Castle. If you wanted some other quotations which reinforce the idea that she's in control, after Macbeth has committed the murder and he forgets to leave the daggers with the guards, she takes the daggers from him by saying, "Give me the daggers." So you can see her impatience with him. You can see her use of imperative again in give. But she also says, "I shame to wear a heart so white." So the white heart is a metaphor for a cowardly heart. So it's bloodless almost. And then when she says, "I shame," it implies that she's ashamed of him in the same way that a mother might talk to a naughty child. So you can see the clear power balance in the relationship. She has all the power. She also says to him, "A little water clears us of this deed." So he's quite concerned about the amount of blood on his hands, and she trivializes it. She makes it seem unimportant, telling him to wash his hands and that will get rid of it. Now this is quite ironic because later in the play, when she goes mad, one of the actions that she keeps performing is washing her hands, suggesting that she feels she cannot clear her hands of the blood. So it's ironic that she advises Macbeth to wash his hands, but later in the play she is the one who is so guilt-stricken that she feels she can't get rid of that blood. And then she also tells him in Act 2, after the murder, "Consider it not so deeply." So again we've got an imperative showing that she's in command, in consider, and we see just how insensitive she appears. Macbeth has just murdered his king, but also a man that regarded him as his worthiest cousin. So naturally he's going to feel quite upset and traumatised. But she just dismisses it as if it was nothing and tells him basically to get over it. Again, this is quite ironic when you consider her later reaction in Act 5 when she goes mad with guilt. And then finally we can see that in this quotation she says, "We'll not fail." Now the use of the modal verb will in we'll, we will not fail, shows that she's completely confident in her plan, arrogant almost. She also uses that inclusive pronoun we to give the impression to him that it's a team effort, whereas actually he is the one that's going to get the blood on his hands. He's the one that's going to be culpable. He's going to be accused of the murder rather than her. So moving on to Act 2 with Lady Macbeth, I've just mentioned that she is quite impatient with her husband after the murder because he seems so worried and so concerned. However, when she's actually in private in Act 2, she says, "Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it," meaning that she would have murdered him herself. The only thing that stopped her was the fact that the elderly Duncan resembles her own father when he's asleep. So this is quite an interesting quotation because it shows that when she's alone on the stage, she does admit that she has feelings. So we see some compassion in her character here. Now, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, Lady Macbeth is often presented or often misunderstood in the play as being completely heartless. So for a bit of a stretch idea, if you can explore quotations like this to prove that actually she does have a compassionate side, it's just that she chooses not to show it to the world or to her husband for fear of being perceived as weak as a woman. Now, this might have reminded the audience of Elizabeth I, so James's predecessor. As I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth was rumoured to have locked herself away and cried after Mary Queen of Scots' execution. So we can see here that Lady Macbeth is similar. To the outside world, they present a very strong image. However, personally and deep down inside, they do have some human emotion and some compassion. The final quotation that I've picked for Lady Macbeth is from Act 5, Scene 1 in her Scene of Madness. Talking about Macduff's wife, who has now been murdered, along with the children, Lady Macbeth says, "The Thane of Fife," which is Macduff, "had a wife. Where is she now?" So firstly, we're seeing that yet again, Lady Macbeth is showing some compassion for another female and another female's suffering. So it's more evidence that she's not completely heartless. As a stretch idea, you could also talk about how in Acts 1 and 2, Lady Macbeth structurally was very, very important in the play. She was the one who called upon the spirits in Act 1 to assist her in their plan. She was the one who then persuaded Macbeth to go through with the murder. She was the one who actually disposed of the murder weapons. So she was very dominant in those earlier acts. However, when she states this in Act 5, it would suggest that women strategically are removed from these narratives, from these stories towards the end, which allows all of the focus to be on the male characters. So obviously this play is called The Tragedy of Macbeth. So at the end, Lady Macbeth needs to be disposed of, she needs to be got rid of, which is why we only see her briefly in Act 5, Scene 1, and then she commits suicide. That allows the tragedy to focus on Macbeth, who has fallen from being highly respected to being despised. So that's quite an important comment to make about how females are used earlier on, certainly in Macbeth, when they have importance, but then they seem to disappear from the narrative. So Shakespeare could be making a comment about how women ultimately are powerless. Okay, so if we move on to Banquo then, obviously Banquo is Macbeth's best friend. In Act 1, when Banquo and Macbeth meet the witches, not only do they make prophecies for Macbeth, they also make prophecies that Banquo's sons will be kings in the future. So at the beginning in Act 1, Banquo actually says, "If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not." So here we can see that Banquo is also ambitious because he's keen to know what the witches have to tell him. The difference is, however, that he does not act upon the witches' prophecies. In fact, he actually questions whether the witches are even there. So he questions, have we eaten on the insane route? So we do see an ambitious streak in him, but he does nothing further about it. So therefore, he's juxtaposed against Macbeth, because obviously Macbeth acts upon the witches' prophecies and takes fate into his own hands. Also, we're told in Act 1 that Banquo will be the root and father of many kings. So you can see in these two quotations from Act 1, with reference to seeds and grains and growth and roots, that lots of nature imagery is used in association with Banquo. Now that's used to suggest that Banquo can rear healthy children, healthy offspring. That again is in direct contrast to Macbeth, and we know that it's one of Macbeth's issues later in the play, that he's not going to be able to pass on the crown to a male heir. So, whereas Banquo is associated with natural imagery, the Macbeths are associated with imagery of poison and contamination, which kills life. So you've got really good examples of juxtaposition there. Later then, in Act 3, Banquo actually performs a soliloquy. This is just before Macbeth orders his murder. So in this soliloquy, along with seeing Banquo's ambition for his sons to become kings, we also see his suspicion of Macbeth when he says, "I fear thou played most foully for it," speaking about the crown. Now, this links to earlier in Act 1, Scene 3, when they first met the witches. So straight away, Banquo observes that Macbeth seems to be rapt by what the witches have to say. Now, rapt means that Macbeth is transfixed or almost hypnotized by those prophecies. So again, we see that Macbeth is more easily tempted than Banquo is. Obviously, because of this suspicion, Macbeth has to eliminate Banquo. Now, the metaphor that Banquo uses here, by using that verb played, suggests that he thinks Macbeth has treated the pursuit of the crown like a game, so he's competed for it, using illegitimate methods. Now, rather than accepting the divine right of kings and the great chain of being, Macbeth has chosen to take fate into his own hands. Later in Act 3, after Banquo has been murdered, Macbeth at the banquet scene sees his ghost and says, "Never shake thy gory locks at me." Now, locks are a reference to Banquo's hair, so he's shaking his head at Macbeth. Now, people use that gesture when they're disappointed with somebody or they feel let down. So obviously, Banquo is incredibly let down and betrayed by Macbeth's behaviour. So yet again, we see this juxtaposition of Banquo and Macbeth. Banquo remained loyal, whereas Macbeth is the example of betrayal. Now, the Jacobean audience would believe that the ghost was actually there. So they would think that Banquo's ghost is haunting Macbeth as punishment for Macbeth's sins. You can see that Macbeth also tries to use an imperative with Banquo's ghost, effectively telling him to leave him alone and go away and not shake his head or show his disappointment. Now, Macbeth did this earlier with the witches, when he tried to command them as well. Now, the fact that Banquo's ghost stays there for a while shows that Macbeth doesn't have the power that he thinks he has, certainly not any power over the supernatural. Right, if we look at the witches next, the play actually opens with them performing spells, and something they say is, "Fair is foul, foul is fair, hover through the thick and filthy air." So you can see here that the witches speak in paradoxes. So what that means is that they seem to contradict themselves. Some of the statements they make seem not to make sense. So if we actually look more closely, when they say fair is foul, foul is fair, they could actually be referring to Macbeth. So he is fair in the fact that he's highly respected and he's got good qualities, but he's also foul at the same time because he's got this ambition that is burning deep inside of him, and that's sinful. So they speak in paradoxes, which deliberately confuses people, other characters, and that's done because the witches enjoy manipulating people, they enjoy confusing people. That's part of the satisfaction they get as evil characters. So they're deliberately unclear in the things they say. You'll notice that they also speak in rhyming couplets here. So that distinguishes them from the other characters who speak in blank verse, which is poetry that doesn't rhyme. So it distinguishes them from the other characters, but it also makes their speeches quite memorable, and it adds this sort of spell-like quality, a prophetic quality, like they're predicting things in the future. So when they speak in these rhyming couplets, we get the impression that future events are being foreshadowed. Now, Macbeth later starts to speak in rhyming couplets himself at the end of Act 1, Scene 7, when he talks about away and mock the time with fairest show, false face must hide what the false heart doth know. And then in Act 2, Scene 1, he uses a rhyming couplet at the end of that soliloquy as well. So that suggests that he has been influenced by the supernatural, by the witches at this point, because he's starting to speak like them. In Act 1 then, when Macbeth and Banquo meet the witches, Macbeth calls them imperfect speakers. Now we can see here that he's using euphemism. He wants to acknowledge that they're not earthly creatures, they're not ordinary women, but he also doesn't want to offend them too much. Now the reason for that is because he knows that they have information that he wants to hear. So he's trying to cooperate with them. He's trying to get them to tell him what their prophecies are. Banquo confirms that these women are not in fact earthly creatures by calling them or saying that they are not like the inhabitants of the earth. Now we can see Macbeth's change of opinion of the witches later in Act 5. So when Macbeth realises that his pursuit of the crown has all been quite futile, quite pointless, and that he's been tricked, he calls the witches juggling fiends. Now this metaphor, this reference to juggling, suggests that Macbeth knows that the witches have treated him like entertainment. They've enjoyed playing with him and teasing him. So we know then that the witches themselves are very duplicitous. They're deliberately misleading him. By calling them fiends at this stage, it also shows that Macbeth is now patently aware that these witches are kin to the devil, so they're working directly for the devil to mislead human beings. So a final thing we could say about the witches is with reference to the stage direction used in Act 1. So when Macbeth commands them to stay and tell him more, we're told that the witches vanish. Now, firstly, this shows that the witches enjoy being playful and they enjoy teasing characters and confusing them, but it also undermines Macbeth's authority as a man and his authority as a thane. So when they defy him and disobey him by disappearing after he's told them to stay, all it does is call Macbeth's power into question. So in the hierarchy, in the great chain of being, men should be above women. And here we're actually seeing that women are disobeying the male characters. So it's quite an interesting thing to look at for gender roles. It also proves that the supernatural was more powerful than human beings, and obviously the Jacobeans would believe quite thoroughly in the supernatural. Obviously, when the witches vanish, all it does is pique Macbeth's interest even more, and it just increases that thirst that he has to know more about his future. So if we move on to Macduff, we've already mentioned earlier that Macduff is juxtaposed against Macbeth because of his loyalty to King Duncan. Now we see that genuine loyalty when Macduff and the guards discover Duncan's dead body. So Macduff states, "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon." So Macduff is urging others to witness the horror. He actually says horror, horror, horror. So he wants other people to see how appalling that murder is. So that genuine disgust proves just how loyal Macduff is to the king. Now, the reference in there to a new Gorgon is metaphorical, and it refers to the Gorgon Medusa, who was a woman, a mythical woman who had snakes for hair. And apparently when anybody looked at Gorgon Medusa in the eyes, you would turn to stone. So what Macduff is suggesting here is that the sight of Duncan's body is so appalling that people will freeze in shock and disgust. Okay, so also in Act 2, upon discovery of the body, Macduff states, "Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, and stole thence the life of the building." So we can see that Macduff is using metaphor here to talk about Duncan's body. So by comparing Duncan's body to a temple, it's suggested that Duncan is the physical representation of God on earth, and he should be worshipped as he is God's chosen representative. So by Duncan being described as a sacred building that embodies all that is good, murdering him is sacrilege, it's offensive to God. So it's almost on a par, it's almost the same as vandalizing a church. So that just shows that Macduff believes in the divine right of kings, and he would never upset the natural order. He believes that Duncan was put on the throne with God's will. So again, we can see just how loyal Macduff remains throughout the play. In Act 5 then, during the fight scene between Macduff and Macbeth, we can see that Macduff says, "I have no words, my voice is in my sword." So this just proves that Macduff is absolutely determined to get his revenge, not only for King Duncan's murder, but also for the murder of his wife and children. So he doesn't want to stand there discussing reasons or excuses with Macbeth. He just wants to take action. Now, this again juxtaposes him against Macbeth, because Macbeth frequently throughout the play uses long soliloquies. So it shows, ironically, for Macbeth the warrior, that Macbeth actually thinks too much about things rather than taking immediate action at times. Now, back in the Jacobean era, people would expect men to act quickly. And here we can see that Macduff is the classic revenger. So he has his reason for revenge and he's determined to get it and get it quickly. Now, when he says, "I have no words," we can see that Macduff is lost for words. He can't find words strong enough for his grief. We can also see through the metaphor, "My voice is in my sword," that Macduff will speak through his actions. So he's going to right the wrongs committed by Macbeth by taking Macbeth's life, and that's the only appropriate punishment at this stage. Macbeth, as he says himself, is far too steeped in blood. So no words, no apologies, no request for forgiveness can redeem Macbeth. Divine justice needs to be served and natural order needs to be restored. This quotation about King Duncan comes from Act 1, Scene 7 in Macbeth's soliloquy. So this is the point at which Macbeth is debating whether or whether not to go through with the regicide. Now, most of this soliloquy is devoted to the reasons why he shouldn't kill Duncan. And as part of that, he says that Duncan's faculties are so meek and he is so clear in his great office that his virtues will plead like angels. So if you look at the words that are put in bold there, we can see through the word meek that Duncan is presented as being quite mild-mannered and humble. So he's not arrogant or particularly aggressive as a leader. Now this is completely opposite to the ambitious Macbeth. We can also see through the choice of the adjective clear that metaphorically Duncan is transparent. Now what I mean by that is what you see is what you get. So he's not hiding anything. He's very open and honest. So he's not duplicitous or two-faced at all. Now yet again that is very different to the Macbeths, who, as we know, will say one thing in public, but behind closed doors they will act and say something else. We can also see when Macbeth says that Duncan has virtues, that Macbeth acknowledges that Duncan is a moral man. So he knows that he is actually inferior and inadequate compared to King Duncan. This also shows that Macbeth is aware that Duncan has all the qualities of a king that would have been chosen by God. So even Macbeth shows awareness that Duncan is the man who rightfully should be on the throne.